September 2023 was the hottest month in recorded history. Last summer, smoke from hundreds of Canadian forest fires blanketed the United States. Maui ignited, the Amazon burned, Libya was deluged, sea levels rose. The world's great rivers and lakes are drying up while climate migrants are pouring across borders. Is it too late to stop climate change? What can the international community do to respond to this existential global crisis? I'm Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. In this broadcast of Talking Foreign Policy, our expert panelists, including the former UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights and the Environment, will discuss the global climate crisis right after the news. Welcome to Talking Foreign Policy, the quarterly radio show and podcast. I'm your host, Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. Today, we're going to be talking about responding to global climate change. Joining us today from North Carolina is our special guest, Professor John Knox of Wake Forest University School of Law. John and I worked together at the U.S. Department of State. Years later, John was the inaugural UN Rapporteur for Human Rights and the Environment. John, it is so great to have you on our program.
It's great to be here, Mike. Thanks for inviting me.
And with us from Omaha, Nebraska, is Professor Mike Kelly, the head of Creighton University's International Law Program and a member of the Board of Directors of the prestigious International Association of Penal Law. Welcome to Talking Foreign Policy, Mike.
Thanks so much, Michael. Good to be here.
And joining us once again from the nation's capital is Dr. Paul Williams, the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, a Nobel Peace Prize nominated NGO. Welcome back to Talking Foreign Policy, Paul.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be back on the program.
I'm joined in the Idea Stream studio in Cleveland by law professor Milena Stereo, who was recently awarded the highest accolade in academia, the Distinguished University Professorship at Cleveland State University. Welcome, Milena.
Thanks, Michael. It's great to be back.
In the first segment of our broadcast, we will be discussing the problem of global climate change. In the second, we'll be looking at the pros and cons of the possible solutions. And in the third segment, we will be joined by Dr. Shannon French, a world-renowned ethicist who is the director of the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence. She'll help us understand the ethical dimensions of the climate crisis. So let's start things off with John Knox. John, tell us how you became the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights and the Environment and what you did in that position.
Thanks, Mike. Again, it's really a pleasure to be here. Well, the United Nations principal human rights body is called the Human Rights Council, and it has special rapporteurs that it appoints to investigate particular areas and to report on countries' compliance and try and promote compliance with the human rights generally. But occasionally it appoints an expert to just try and clarify part of the field. And so in 2012, it decided to appoint an independent expert to essentially explain the relationship between human rights and the environment. I had done a fair amount of work in both areas, including for governments, especially the Maldives, on a pro bono basis. The Maldives is a small island state that was involved in the initiative to create this mandate. And so the council, I applied at the encouragement of the Maldives and some others, and the council ended up appointing me. Over the next 6 years, I visited countries, I issued reports, I investigated the relationship of human rights and the environment really in different places all over the world. And essentially, I tried to promote a better understanding of how the relationship is interdependent and that a healthy environment is necessary for the full enjoyment of human rights, and how the exercise of human rights is vital to the protection of the environment.
Well, John, now that we've established your bona fides, can you give us some background about the global climate crisis?
Sure, and the global climate crisis is really the reason I think why the mandate was created, because that, of course, is what particularly concerned the Maldives 10 years ago or over 10 years ago now, and so many other people around the world as well. I mean, basically, the facts are probably pretty well known to many of your listeners. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere contributes to the so-called greenhouse effect. That is, it means that the atmosphere retains warmth from the sun, making conditions here on Earth warmer than they otherwise would be. That, to be clear, is a good thing. The greenhouse effect is why life on Earth exists as it does. But the problem is, as a result of burning fossil fuels, we are rapidly increasing the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Essentially, it's like we're steadily turning up the thermostat on the entire planet. That's because ever since the Industrial Revolution, the most important fuels we use for energy have been carbon-based: coal, natural gas, and petroleum. And when we burn them, their combustion produces carbon dioxide. As a result, the more our economies grow, the more carbon dioxide we produce. And as a result of that, we've now raised the global average temperature of the entire planet about 2 degrees Fahrenheit, or a little over 1 degree Celsius, above where it was at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution.
So, John, in this day and age, it's really hard to get everybody to believe the same facts. In fact, there's these statements like, there's alternative facts. So how do you answer those who say climate change isn't really a problem that we should be concerned about?
I guess I would say that, what you hear sometimes is an idea that, well, the temperature of the planet has fluctuated quite a bit over its very lengthy billion-plus-year history, and that, of course, is true. The problem is that most of that fluctuation, the vast, vast amount of it, has not involved human beings as we now are. For about the last 10,000 years, which is essentially all of recorded human history, the global average temperature of the planet has really not varied very much, only within a range of about 1 degree Celsius, or in other words, about half a degree either way. We are now leaving that range and moving into uncharted territory. And as a point of comparison, the last time the planet was outside that range was the end of the last ice age, about 12,000 years ago, when global temperatures were about 3 to 5 degrees colder than they are now. For a sense of how much difference that makes, ice sheets then were a mile thick over what's now New York and Detroit, and I believe Cleveland as well. So small changes in the global average temperature can have gigantic effects. And in fact, we're already seeing them start. California has seen the worst wildfires in its history. Pakistan has seen the worst flooding in its history. Just last week, Acapulco got hit with the second most rapidly intensifying hurricane ever recorded. These are all warning signs of the warmer world that we're moving into. And remember, the world as it is now is the coolest world we will all live in for the rest of our lives. It's only getting warmer from here on, which means the effects of that warming climate are going to intensify until we phase out fossil fuels.
So, John, on the other side of the coin, how do you answer those who say it's just too late now to do anything to stop climate change because we've already crossed these important tipping points?
Well, the problem is the thermostat's just going to keep going up until we actually stop it. So while it is too late to hold the temperature increase to 1 degree, it's definitely not too late to hold it to 2 degrees. A 2 degree temperature rise would still be disastrous in many ways, but holding it at 2 degrees would be far better than letting it rise to 3, and so on and so forth. However bad things get, there's no point at which it would ever be possible to say, well, this is as bad as it can get. Things can't get any worse. Things can always get worse if the temperature keeps getting hotter, and stopping things from getting worse is always worth fighting for.
That's a really helpful way to put it. Let's bring our international law expert, Milena Stereo, into the conversation. Milena, can you provide us some concrete examples of the threats that global climate change poses?
Sure, Michael. Some of such threats include things like rising sea levels or the threat of rising sea levels.
And why do we care about that?
We care about that because rising sea levels can submerge entire states, which literally means the disappearance of entire states. And here we can talk about Pacific Island nations, places like Tuvalu or Vanuatu, or also Indian Ocean nations such as the Maldives, which John mentioned earlier. those instances where entire states are submerged or parts of states are submerged can lead to massive migrations of entire populations. They can also lead to starvation because you have entire groups of people who can no longer produce food, who can no longer sustain themselves. And that can also lead towards war, conflict, violence, as states start to aggressively battle each other over natural resources.
All right, so the situation is pretty grave. Let me turn to Michael Kelly. The countries of the world have pledged to make significant reductions in so-called greenhouse gases when they signed the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015. Mike Kelly, what are some of the ways that countries can reach those targets?
Well, thank you, Michael. Yes, you're right. How do we actually get at reducing our carbon footprints? You can look at the usual suspects, reduce the use of electricity, produce electricity using different means than we use now, like solar and wind technology, stop deforestation, start reforestation, reduce travel. That last one, a lot of people don't want to hear about, but if you are going to travel in an electric vehicle. A big component of American corporations beginning to meet their ESG standards, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in segment 3 of this program, is converting their fleets to electric vehicles. We see Amazon doing this now actively across the United States. Transportation is 30% of our greenhouse gas source production, according from the Environmental Protection Agency. So that's a huge chunk of the pie that we can take a good whack at. In addition to that, realigning priorities within your federal departments is certainly one way to do this. Carbon emissions are not just the EPA's responsibility. It's the Department of Transportation's responsibility as well. And if they prioritize that, then we'll see more movement in this area.
All right, well, none of that's going to be cheap. Paul Williams, how difficult do you think it will be to stop catastrophic rising levels of CO2 and methane without disrupting economic growth in a time when the economies of the world are all under pressure?
Well, Michael, I think it's a three-part puzzle. As John had mentioned, we've based our economic infrastructure on fossil fuels as a result of the Industrial Revolution, and developing states looking to move into the upper tier of development, they're doing it based on fossil fuels. But as Mike Kelly has pointed out, there is technology, electricity, wind, solar, nuclear. The real problem that I want to put out there is that most of our concern with global warming seems to be performance art. People are really big on talking about global warming, but in order to restructure, we need to put down the steak knife. We need to put on the tennis shoes. We need to get off the airplane. And I think we see this, the Biden administration is the most pro-green administration we've had in a long time, but I'm not entirely sure it's serious. We look at the subsidies for electric vehicles. They're high-end electric vehicles. Who has $75,000, $80,000, even with the tax subsidy, to buy an electric vehicle? We need to start getting serious about shifting our consumption patterns and getting people to genuinely embrace a low carbon footprint lifestyle. Otherwise, we're just going to keep talking in circles.
Well, that's a good place for us to take our first break. When we return, we're going to be talking about the international framework for addressing climate change. So stay with us. Welcome back to Talking Foreign Policy, brought to you by Case Western Reserve University and IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. I'm joined today from North Carolina by the former UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights and the Environment, John Knox. From D.C. by the President of the Public International Law and Policy Group, Paul Williams. From Omaha, Nebraska by Creighton University professor Michael Kelly, and here in the IdeaStream studio by Professor Milena Stereo of Cleveland State University School of Law. Now, in this segment of our show, we're going to be discussing the weaknesses of the Paris Climate Agreement and how to shore those up. So let's begin with John Knox. John, what is the Paris Climate Agreement and what does it do?
So, Mike, the Paris Climate Agreement is the most important single climate agreement, and it was adopted in 2015 after years of negotiation. Almost all of the countries in the world belong to it now. The agreement is lengthy, but at its core, it's really pretty simple. Countries agreed to try to hold the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and they said they'll try and pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. To that end, every country has to submit a so-called nationally determined contribution, or NDC. The thing is, these nationally determined contributions are just what they sound like. That is, they're nationally determined. In other words, each country can decide for itself what it will do to reduce its own greenhouse gas emissions. Then every 5 years, every party is supposed to submit a new NDC, which should, in the words of the treaty, represent a progression beyond the party's then current nationally determined contribution and reflect its highest possible ambition, reflecting its common but differentiated responsibilities. So the idea here again is, in principle, when you add all these NDCs up, they should result in a overall performance that gets us well below 2 degrees Celsius.
So let me turn to Paul Williams. The Paris Agreement, which John was just describing, focuses not just on reducing greenhouse gases, but there's also provisions in there about climate change adaptation. What are some of the potential technologies that can mitigate the effects of climate change as envisioned by the agreement?
Well, Michael, I think in terms of the technology end of the spectrum, we're in pretty good shape in terms of being on the cusp of an ability to think through how to adapt to climate change. We should not take our foot off the gas, so to speak, on reducing the trajectory of global warming, but with artificial intelligence, we can be a lot smarter about how we manage our water, which is going to be becoming increasingly scarce resource with climate change. We can be a lot smarter about how we manage the food production, which is, as we see already, under threat from climate change. So I think rather than worrying about Arnold Schwarzenegger and Skynet taking over the world, we should be all in on artificial intelligence to basically augment our thinking on how we can adapt to the changed climate. As John said, it's never going to be cooler than it is now. So we need to adapt to that because we're already experiencing the consequences. And then we also, in addition, have to figure out how to stop it from getting warmer. But the technology is out there. We just have to harness it.
Now, Paul, I don't know if former President Trump was afraid of the Terminator or not, but I do know that he didn't like the Paris Climate Agreement. Is the U.S. a party to it or not? I'm kind of confused about its status.
Yes, no, yes. So we signed it up. We signed up for it in 2015. Then the Trump administration withdrew from it in 2020, setting us back in our preparations and our adaptation. But the Biden administration has put us back into the Paris Agreement as of 2021.
All right. So the largest producer of greenhouse gases is back in business in the treaty. Milena Stereo, John Knox alluded to this, but can you spell out some of the weaknesses of the Paris Agreement?
Sure, Michael. The Paris Agreement, unfortunately, is a fairly weak agreement. Although there are 195 countries that have signed on, this agreement is essentially not enforceable. As John mentioned, countries submit these so-called NDCs, nationally determined contributions, but these are essentially 5-year cycles, 5-year promises to adopt a certain number of measures to protect the environment, to reduce climate change. However, these are, as John said, nationally determined, and these are not really enforceable, and countries can't force each other to do something. So if, for example, the United States says we're going to do X, Y, and Z, even if the X, Y, and Z is very weak, no other country can force the United States to do anything in particular under the Paris Accord. And Michael, very sadly, we know that as of September of 2023, as of now, we know that most countries that are party to the Paris Accords are not on target to meet their NDCs.
All right, it's not working. Mike Kelly, do you think we need some kind of an additional agreement to shore it up, a Paris Agreement protocol? What would such an agreement do?
Well, yes, we do. The question is, how would you design it? Per the terms of the framework agreement itself, any protocol that comes along will likely be technology based. And this will be hooked into technology transfer to nations that don't have the technology and capacity building. Those kind of go hand in hand. One of the stumbling blocks there is proprietary information from the businesses that develop the technology you're going to use. These are intellectual property issues. But when you think about, we ran into the same stumbling block during COVID. Big pharma didn't want to share a lot of its technology and its intellectual property, but we got around that in order to get the vaccinations we needed to Latin America, Africa, and Asia. So we can do it. It's just a question of whether, we'll be able to prioritize this in a way to do it. Another model that isn't really envisioned too much in the agreement itself is utilizing the IPCC more. The IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. These are the UN scientists who are telling us what's going to happen. They have the science. If we let the IPCC in a protocol begin allotting reduction amounts to each country instead of each country doing it themselves on a scientific basis, that would have a lot more impact.
I love these ideas, Mike. But let me turn to Paul. Paul Williams, you've negotiated a number of international agreements. You know how hard it is to do. What are the political obstacles to adopting the kind of proposal that Mike Kelly is talking about?
Well, Michael, I think the primary political obstacle is that combating climate change has in fact become big business. And so each state is going to look at the solution to climate change through the lens of its domestic economy. The French, nuclear power, that's the solution. The Germans, wind farms, particularly wind machines that have been built in Germany. The Chinese, solar, since they've cornered that market. The Americans, our technology on electricity. So when you sit down with the scientists, they're going to be sitting next to the economists, and the economists are going to say, have we got a deal for you? Nuclear, wind, solar, electric. And then, as Michael Kelly noted, the transfer of technology, huge problems at the moment with transfer of technology and stealing of technology. So the solution, which is the transfer of technology, this is the very inopportune time politically to be suggesting we transfer technology on these highly, highly, highly valuable approaches to combating climate change.
So we have a flawed treaty. We have a lot of obstacles to fixing it. The latest development is the United Nations General Assembly adoption of a resolution recognizing a human right to a healthy environment. Now, John Knox played a key role in the adoption of that resolution. John, can you tell us about what it adds to what the UN human rights bodies have already said about climate change and human rights?
Sure. The United Nations recognition of the human right to a healthy environment is important because it's the first time that the international community as a whole has recognized that we all do have a human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And it's important to note that it did so by an overwhelming margin. 161 states voted in favor, none voted against, and only a handful of states abstained, led by China, Iran, and Russia. At the same time, while this UN recognition is a brand new thing, it comes against the backdrop of at least 20 years of increasing application of a very wide range of human rights to environmental issues, including rights to life and health. Human rights bodies, in other words, have already greened human rights by holding that states have obligations to take steps to protect people from environmental harm, including by respecting their rights to participate in environmental decision making, to receive environmental information, to obtain effective remedies, and so forth. Human rights are really, I think, the most exciting thing to happen to environmental law and policy in a long time. Plaintiffs around the world in national and international courts are successfully arguing that environmental harm of all types, including climate change, violates their human rights. The Urgenda decision by the Dutch Supreme Court may be the single most important precedent. In 2019, the court ordered the Netherlands to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions more quickly in order to comply with its obligations under the European Convention of Human Rights. But these developments aren't just in Europe. A state court in Montana just this August issued a decision that the right to a healthy environment contained in its state constitution requires the state to consider the effects of climate change in its decisions. So against this backdrop of just so much going on in this field of human rights and the environment, I think the main value of the resolution is not that it adds a new layer of law. The resolution itself isn't even legally binding, but rather that it continues to raise the visibility of the issue in a way that can catalyze further action. As Eleanor Roosevelt said about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights when it was adopted in 1948, it will serve as a common standard of achievement for all peoples of all nations. Indeed, this new resolution adding the human right to a healthy environment to the human rights pantheon has been called effectively Article 31 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
You know, and I will note that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is having its 75th anniversary next month.
Yeah.
So it's a good time to be thinking about its importance and its relationship to climate change. And I think what you're describing, John Knox, is a paradigm shift where people are starting to think and courts are starting to address climate change as a human rights problem. So let me go to Michael Kelly. What effect do you think that the General Assembly resolution will have on these ongoing cases and on the efforts to address climate change?
Oh, huge effect. There is a logical sequence. You can't have a healthy environment unless you control climate change. The linkage there is obvious. And this General Assembly resolution really, in a sense, activates a lot of pre-existing language and a lot of modern constitutions and statutes within states around the world. So just using John Knox's example about the Dutch court ordering the government of the Netherlands to comply with carbon reduction schemes, that was an order to comply with international law that came from a domestic court. So international law can be used by domestic courts to force the countries to take reductions. And the Netherlands, in compliance with that, is going to be reducing over the next 3 years by 20% the number of flights coming into its giant airport, Schiphol Airport, because the Netherlands is a small country. It's got two things. It's got tulips and a giant airport. So the way it's going to reduce its carbon footprint is to reduce the carbon footprint of that airport.
All right, so Milena Stereo, John Knox just mentioned the several international court cases that are pending that will address climate change. There are 3 advisory opinions pending before the International Court of Justice, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and the Law of the Sea Tribunal. And there are also 3 cases before the European Court of Human Rights. And then Mike Kelly was just telling us about some national cases as well. Can you briefly walk us through those cases and what their potential ramifications will be?
Sure, Michael. So probably the most significant case is pending before the International Court of Justice in The Hague. And this case was a request for an advisory opinion from the court coming through a General Assembly resolutions in the UN in really a campaign spearheaded by Vanuatu, which is one of these Pacific Island nations threatened by rising sea levels. And that request for an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice essentially asked the court to say, what are the state's legal obligations when it comes to climate change and protecting the environment? So that case is pending, would have huge ramifications depending on what the court rules. There are also other cases pending before regional human rights courts. So you mentioned the European Court of Human Rights. There are 3 cases pending there, one brought from Portugal, one from Switzerland, and one from Norway. There's also a request for an advisory opinion pending in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. This is a case brought by Chile and Colombia, also asking the court to decide what the state's obligations are under the American Convention on Human Rights. And then there's a case at the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, a case also brought by small island nations threatened by rising sea levels, asking the court to tell us more about states' obligations to protect the marine environment. And so the potential ramifications of all of these cases, coupled with the national cases, which John and Mike Kelly just mentioned, are tremendous.
Do countries have to follow the decisions of these different courts?
Yes, some of the courts, absolutely. So, for example, the decisions of the International Court of Justice are binding on all states, and the decisions of regional human rights courts are binding on the states that are covered by those regional human rights treaties.
All right, so Paul Williams, you've actually argued cases before international courts. The most famous one was the ABA arbitration that you were involved in. How do you think that these cases that Milena just described will be decided? And how is the timing of these cases potentially important?
Well, Michael, I think the timing of these cases is important because of the hierarchy. If the International Court of Justice issues a decision, it's likely that the European Court, the Inter-American Court, the Law of the Sea Tribunal would feel compelled to follow that. Now, the downside is the International Court of Justice is the least innovative and the least forward-leaning, and you're more likely to get the type of outcome that would benefit pushing back on climate change from the European Court or the Inter-American Court. And so my sense is you're likely to get a variety of opinions. Unless the ICJ goes first, you're likely to get some very forward-leaning Law of the Sea and European Court, followed by the Inter-American Commission, and then we'll have confusion, and this won't be a good thing. So great that they're doing a full court press on using rule of law. Us law professors, we're very excited about that. Not so great that they're forum shopping for the best linkage between the environment and human right. And if it's muddled, then it's easy to say it's muddled, business as usual. Let's just keep warming the planet.
Well, that's going to be another concern then that we'll have to muddle through, as you say, Paul. It's time for another short break. When we return, we're going to be joined by a renowned international ethicist, and we'll talk about the ethical issues related to addressing global climate change. Back in a moment. This is Michael Scharf, Dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law, and we're back with Talking Foreign Policy. I'm joined today by experts on international environmental law and policy, and we're talking about the international response to the global climate change crisis. In this final segment, we're going to be focusing on ethical issues related to climate change. With perfect timing, Dr. Shannon French of the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence at Case Western Reserve University has just entered the studio. Shannon, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
So, Shannon, it's said that there are three major ethical dilemmas that complicate the climate change debate. So first, how to balance the rights and responsibilities of the developed and developing world. Second, how to evaluate geoengineering schemes designed to reverse or slow climate change. And third, how to assess our responsibility to future generations who must live with a climate that we are shaping today. So, Shannon, as an ethicist, what is your take on those three dilemmas?
Well, I see you put me right in it the moment I walked in, which is only fair. That's what I'm here for. To the first point about balancing the rights and responsibilities of developed and developing parts of the world, unfortunately, and this will come as a surprise to no one, it is the most vulnerable places on Earth that are the least able to make a difference when it comes to climate change because they aren't the ones producing the most damage. So even if they did everything exactly right and lowered their carbon footprint as low as it could go, they will still suffer from the effects of the practices in other nations, particularly those that are developed and those on the higher end of the developing scale who are ramping up their levels of industry and so forth. So when you look at that, what it creates is this injustice that runs very deep across the international scheme. And the people who are suffering the most are also not necessarily the ones who have the greatest voice or ability to advocate for themselves in that context. So you have the need even more than ever for activists to draw attention to the plight of these places. But they're unfortunately really against a headwind because they have to convince the countries who aren't suffering as much or not as radical effects to make what will feel to them like radical changes to protect places that are out of sight and out of mind. So this is a deep concern.
So the second part was about the geoengineering schemes. And I know that, some of these are high-risk ideas like seeding clouds and so forth. What's your take on that?
Well, I'm all for us exploring technological solutions, but you can hear the but coming, right? So the but is we have to be careful not to fall for hype. There's something out there called technological optimism. And it sounds so nice and cheery, but it can be a negative when people rely on it overly much in place of other tried and true solutions. So going forward, the ethical approach is to make sure that if you are funding these high risk, potentially high returned engineering options that may make a huge difference, you can't then cut off the funding to the things we know are making perhaps more incremental but important and tried and true progress. Because if you put all your eggs in one basket, then again, you are just throwing some people under the environmental bus, and that's not acceptable.
And then, U.S. policy seems to be made every 2 years with a change of Congress, every 4 to 8 years with a change of presidency. How do we make the long-range issues, the responsibility to future generations, something that the current policymakers actually care about?
So this is a huge issue, and I first want to applaud the fact that there are some really outstanding and notable advocates and activists in the youngest generation at the moment. Of course, everyone's heard of Greta Thunberg, but there's many others as well who are speaking up and demanding that people who are above them in age but don't seem to be thinking of them in their decision-making take them seriously. But the problem is that whenever you're asking people to vote for future generations, you are asking for a sacrifice. You are saying, we need you to let go of something you want in the here and now in order that others can have something in the future. And here's where that idea of technological optimism comes into play. A lot of people will try to smooth over their conscience about what we're doing to the planet by saying, oh, by the time these kids grow up or the kids who aren't born yet grow up, some solution will have been found and they'll be fine. And there's just no basis for that truly to rely on, and it's certainly not an ethical decision to do that. And I would simply want to add to that in thinking about what we owe to future generations, we have to think in terms of these are people who have the least amount of voice you can possibly imagine. I've talked about those in vulnerable countries having a problem trying to get attention, but future generations are not even born yet. They can't stand up and say, look what you did to my planet. So short of time travel, they can't say what's going to happen, and so they can't make this persuasive case except by doing what they're trying to do, which is say, care.
I want to return to John Knox, the former UN Rapporteur for Human Rights and the Environment, and ask you, John, about the responsibility to one of the vulnerable populations out there that are affected by climate change. And by that, I'm talking about the so-called climate refugees. Those are people who have to flee their countries because they've been submerged or because of drought or because of fires, and they literally don't have anywhere else to go. They don't have any rights. John, what is your take on that problem?
So it's a thorny problem legally in some ways and not in others. Part of the problem is that the term refugee is defined by international law narrowly as someone who's unable or unwilling to return to their home country because of a well-founded fear of being persecuted for various reasons, including race, religion, or nationality. That doesn't really fit climate migrants. That's not really the issue. So the problem is existing refugee law doesn't really seem to apply very well to them. However, the international human rights body that oversees the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights has interpreted that to say that even those who aren't refugees in that sense still have a right not to be returned to a country if doing so would cause a risk of irreparable harm to their right to life. In other words, you can't send someone back to a country if there's a really good chance that they're going to be killed as a result or lose their life. That body, the Human Rights Committee it's called, in 2020 interpreted the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights to say, that rule applies to climate migrants as well. The situation in that case was one involving a small island state, Kiribati, in the South Pacific, and the committee said, while right now we can't say that New Zealand is violating their obligations by sending someone back to this small island state, that could well change. In fact, we expect that it probably will without what they called robust national and international efforts. In other words, in the not very far future, it's going to be more and more a clearer violation of human rights law to send climate migrants back to places where they would be essentially risking their lives. Now, that's the legal standard, but practically, it's just extremely hard to imagine the large scale evacuation of the literally millions of people who live in low lying coastal areas or small island states or in other areas of the world that are increasingly going to be made uninhabitable unless we change our ways. So, another way of thinking about this is we really cannot rely on large scale migration to solve this problem. We simply have to find ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which again means we have to phase out fossil fuels as quickly as possible.
So, based on that last observation, let me ask, anybody can chime in. What happens to a country and its people if it's submerged and it no longer has land? Does it lose its status at the United Nations and other international organizations? What happens to its treaties? What happens to its people's nationality? Elena, do you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. That's, Michael, obviously a catastrophic, that would be a catastrophic outcome. Imagine the heartache and all the unfortunate legal consequences flowing from the fact that a state is disappearing. Now, we do have precedent in the international arena for states disappearing because of other reasons. So, for example, the USSR was dismantled in the early 90s. So was the former Yugoslavia. So were some other states. And when that happens, typically those larger states break apart into smaller chunks, smaller entities. But that is different than when an entire country disappears. Many of these legal issues would have to be negotiated with other states. And I think the biggest difficulty, probably one of the hardest legal challenges, would be, where do the people of that state go? Do other countries have a responsibility to take them in as refugees? And as John Knox just explained, the problem is that refugee law is not well suited for these environmental crises because these, environmental migrants don't necessarily qualify as refugees.
Another unexpected challenge to this whole crisis. Shannon, your real expertise is in the area of war and morality. And war and other armed conflicts often cause considerable environmental damage. Does the just war tradition that you've written so much about have anything to say about this?
Well, yes, I just came from my war and morality class. Well, surprisingly to many people, the just war tradition has actually cared about environmental damage since ancient times. That's not that well known. But here's an example in the Code of Deuteronomy, which is found in the Old Testament. It talks about how it's against the rules of war to cut down fruit-bearing trees. And the argument behind it is made very clear that it's a multi-generational harm, that it takes so long to cultivate the trees back to where they were that you're harming future generations, back to our earlier point. And that's seen as a crime, and in that context actually also a sin, which is interesting. So there's this awareness that is beyond the allowable acts of war. However, the however in this case is it keeps happening. And we know that some of the weapons of war, obviously nuclear weapons, but other things that have been used like napalm and so forth, have obvious and lasting environmental damage. And then there are other consequences of large deployed forces like the now notorious burn pits, which were used by U.S. forces, hurting both them and the broader environment that they left behind, and leaving long-term health consequences. So war is this, unfortunately, accelerator of environmental damage.
Now, Paul Williams, as a peace negotiator, what role should responsibility for the destruction of the environment, as Shannon was describing, play in any peace agreement following a conflict? Let's say, for example, the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, Michael, I think given that there's plenty of damage happening to the environment through global warming, we should be outraged by topping it up with intentional damage during a time of war. And I think what we've seen is Russia very aggressively not only targeting the people and the infrastructure of Ukraine, but also the environment of Ukraine. Blowing up the Kharkova Dam in order to flood thousands of hectares out of quote unquote military desire. There has to be accountability. We should double down on our efforts to make ecocide a crime. The peace agreement, whenever it comes, should have clear provisions for holding those in Russia who committed these environmental crimes, this ecocide, responsible. You can't negotiate it away. You can't, on one hand, be trying to negotiate a global compact to reduce climate change and global warming, and on the other hand, negotiating amnesties and immunities for ecocide and environmental crimes in a peace agreement because, well, it's war. No, I think now's the time to hold people responsible across the board for their damage to the environment, specifically if it's done intentionally during a time of war.
And Milena is waving at me across from me in the studio. Milena, Paul just mentioned this crime of ecocide or ecocide. Can you tell us about the proposals to recognize that as a new crime, the efforts and why those are important?
Yes, Michael. So as of now, crimes that have to do with the intentional destruction of the environment can be prosecuted as war crimes that Paul already alluded to. So, for example, under the International Criminal Court's Rome Statute, Article 8.2b already provides as one of the enumerated war crimes the intentional launching of an attack in the knowledge that such an attack will cause widespread, long-term, and severe damage to the natural environment. However, at the ICC at least, no such crimes have actually been prosecuted. And so because of that, over the last 2-3 years, campaign...
And the ICC is the International Criminal Court.
The International Criminal Court, which actually has jurisdiction over the situation in Ukraine, to go back to your hypothetical. Most recently, though, over the last 2-3 years, a group of experts and advocates have been leading the so-called Stop Ecocide International campaign, which has convened a panel of experts to develop the definition of ecocide and to lobby states towards including the crime of ecocide as an additional crime under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. According to this group, the definition of ecocide would be the crime would consist of unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. So the fact that we would develop a wholly separate crime, a fifth crime under the statute of the International Criminal Court is extremely significant, as it could potentially influence prosecutors at the International Criminal Court to actually go ahead and charge individuals with this crime as a separate crime, not just as one of many enumerated war crimes.
All right, I want to switch from this idea of war crimes back to the bigger picture and go back to John Knox, our former UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights and the Environment. Generational politics are playing a role in the climate change policy-making debate. And Shannon French mentioned Greta Thunberg, the famous young Swedish environmental activist who was Time Magazine's Person of the Year. So, John, is Greta Thunberg a naive teenager or a rising leader of a global movement?
I think I would pick the second, Mike, with the caveat that, as Shannon said, she's actually only one of many youth leaders rising up. I think she and they are trying to speak for the children and youth who are going to be living in the world that we are now making. Our decisions, and by our I mean the adult leaders in the world today, are shaping their lives, and they have every reason to be concerned about that, and they have very little input into the decisions that are being made. I mean, frankly, no one on this podcast is likely to be alive in 2080, much less 2100. I hope this won't come as a shock to anyone, but many people living on the planet now will be. I have two nieces, for example, who were born in 2016. In 2100, they're going to celebrate their 84th birthdays, which means that they will then be a year younger than my mother, their grandmother, is right now. That future is just not that far away. So voices like Greta Thunberg's are here to remind us that the next generation, her generation, and those of our children are watching us and are already blaming our generation for the incredible disasters we're threatening to leave for them if we don't change our ways now.
All right, in the last 2 minutes of our program, I want to turn to Michael Kelly and ask you, what are the tools that the young environmental activists are successfully using to pursue change?
Well, Michael, lawsuits. In a lawsuit brought by 16 teenagers, a Montana trial court ruled in August of this year that a provision of the Montana Environmental Policy Act prohibiting consideration of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change impacts in its environmental reviews violated these kids' right to a clean and healthful environment under the Montana Constitution. So they actually leveraged a piece of the Constitution which guarantees them a clean environment, and which the court said, quote, includes climate as part of the environmental life support system. The judge went on to say that what happens in Montana has a real impact on fossil fuel energy systems, CO2 emissions, and global warming, and that Montana's actions to permit fossil fuel activities with no climate carbon footprint analysis increased Montana's emissions and, quote, exacerbated anthropogenic climate change and caused further harms to Montana's environment and its citizens, especially its youth.
Mike,
this Montana trial court judge actually singled them out.
Yeah, that's a really great place to bring our program to a close. So we're out of time, and I'd like to thank our experts for being with us today and helping us understand the ramifications of responding to the problems caused by global climate change. And as Mike Kelly was just talking about, what everybody, including the youth, can do about it. John Knox, Paul Williams, Mike Kelly, Milena Stereo, and Shannon French, thank you so much for providing your insights about this important topic. I'm Michael Scharf. You've been listening to Talking Foreign Policy.